Welcome back to the Nasty Metal Productions channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week video. This is episode number 232. For today's episode, I will be celebrating the 40th anniversary for Bark at the Moon, the third studio album solo release for, of course, the self-proclaimed Prince of Darkness himself, Ozzy Osbourne. Originally released on November 15th, 1983 via both Epic Records in certain parts of Europe and CBS Associated Records for the United States. So, without further ado, let's begin. After the fairly successful Diary of a Madman, Ozzy and the band was obviously looking forward to tour for it. But by the turn of 1982, things would take an unsuspecting turn. On March 19th, the devastating plane crash that unfortunately killed Randy Rhoads and even Rachel Youngblood, who was both the costume and makeup designer. The plane, which was piloted by their tour bus driver Andrew Aycock, was flying through Florida. But as soon the left wing of the aircraft clipped the bus, which caused the plane to graze a tree and crash into the garage of a nearby mansion, ultimately killing Rhoads, Aycock, and Youngblood. They were only a week away from playing Madison Square Garden. Experiencing firsthand the horrific death of his close friend and bandmate, Ozzy fell into a deep depression, which caused him to shave his head and then endured him to wear that shitty-looking wig. The tour was unfortunately cancelled only for, 2 weeks, while Osbourne, Sharon, and Aldridge returned to Los Angeles to take stock, while Sarzo remained in Florida with family. This led to Ozzy to search for replacements. He first tried with Gary Moore, but Moore refused. Robert Sarzo, brother of the band's bassist Rudy Sarzo, was chosen to replace Rhoads. But the late great Bernie Tormé, who was just fresh off of his exit from Gillan, left England to fly out to California after being promised by Jack Records, Sharon's daddy's label, that he had the job. So once Sharon caught wind of this, they had no choice but to hire Bernie over Rudy's brother. After performing a handful of shows, Bernie informed Sharon that he would be exiting the tour to fly back to England, obviously to focus more on his solo career. So this left Ozzy and Sharon to search for another replacement. After an audition that took place at a hotel room, Osbourne selected Night Ranger's Brad Gillis to finish the tour. This concluded with the lukewarm release of the live album Speak of the Devil, or Talk of the Devil, for European markets, which Ozzy in later years claimed was only released to satisfy his contractual obligations. After this, Gillis would leave to continue with Night Ranger. Later in 1982, Osbourne appeared as lead vocalist on the (not was) pop dance track Shake Your Head (Let's Go to Bed), which would be released in 1983. The song would eventually be remixed and re-released in the early 1990s for a (not was) hits album in Europe. It reached number 4 on the UK singles chart. However, that wouldn't be the only interesting thing to happen to Ozzy in 1983. He would soon discover a young axe slinger named Jakey Lee, who had previously played in Rat and would, at the time, was still relatively a member of Rough Cut. After being approached, Jake would take the offer and leave Rough Cut for Ozzy Osbourne. They would no sooner head out to Ridge Farm Studios in Rusper, England, with producer Max Norman to record what would be Ozzy's third solo album. 10 songs would be laid down, though technically 9 songs were chosen, leaving the song One Up the B-side to be released as the ironically B-side to the Bark at the Moon 7" 45 single. The album would then finally be released on November 15th, 1983, which, of course, ended up being the first posthumous Randy Rhoads studio album. So the tracklist situation is different here. While there are 8 tracks, however, because this was released in both Europe and the US, that means the track listing varies. The track list for the Epic Records pressings clocks in at the length of 38 minutes and 42 seconds, whereas the track list for the CBS Associated pressings clock in at the length of 38 minutes and 30 seconds. So the track list for the Epic pressing is as follows. Starting off with Rock and Roll Rebel, then of course on to the title track, You're No Different, Now You See It, parentheses, Now You Don't, Forever, So Tired, Waiting for Darkness, and then ending with Spiders. Now, as for the track list for the US pressings, being the ones that were released through the CBS Associated Records label, the track listing is as follows here. And this is the track listing that I'm most familiar with, because again, I'm from the United States. So here, this is more normal to me. This, of course, kicks off with the title track, then into You're No Different, Now You See It, parentheses, Now You Don't, Rock and Roll Rebel, and that, of course, all ends off the first half of the album. The second half, of course, starts with Century of Eternity, which was originally titled as Forever for the European pressings. Then on to So Tired, Slow Down, which, of course, was not featured on the European pressings. And then, of course, it ends with Waiting for Darkness. So technically, here in the United States, we got the track Slow Down instead of Spiders. So, there you go. There it is. There's your track listing, folks. So with Bark at the Moon being the first album of original written material since the death of Randy Rhoads, plenty of fans, core fans, felt that this also meant the shift towards a more commercial sound. There is no doubt Ozzy was beginning to venture further into more pop terrain due to some of the choice hits. But besides containing songs like You're No Different and So Tired, there really isn't anything here that I truly find to be that much different from what Ozzy and the band was writing on the first 2. I mean, the title track isn't technically that far different from the structuring of previous bangers like Over the Mountain or I Don't Know. Sure, it may sound a bit more slicker, but the heart is still there. It just flat out rocks. Then there are songs like Rock and Roll Rebel and Slow Down, which are sorta pushing toward that more mainstream style of hard rock. But even these songs are not that far different compared to what was present on Diary of a Madman. I mean, Rock and Roll Rebel is a fun, catchy rocker with undeniable riffs and hooks, with lyrics that see Ozzy taking further shots at TV evangelists who are just using Ozzy as their main tool to spread their worldwide spread satanic panic rhetoric. And Slow Down is technically the same as SATO, due to its galloping rhythm pace. It just doesn't have that same kind of darkness to it that SATO had contained. but it still rocks. But to truly say that Ozzy was stripping away those dark, eerie aspects accompanied with those heavy riffs is unfair to say, cause by one listen to tracks like Century of Eternity, aka Forever for Euro countries, Waiting for Darkness and Spiders, Century of Eternity is easily the most fast and aggressive song in all of Ozzy's discography, getting as close to speed metal that Ozzy has ever gotten to, practically matching the quality of Judas Priest. It really fits Jakey's style, which he just shreds his ass off. Bob Daisley is playing at a pace that he normally never played at, and Tommy Aldridge, who has had before played at this style, and Gary Moore, just matches Jakey's pacing, making this a match made in heaven, or hell. Then there is the creepy little bugger that is Spiders, which tends to remind me more of Alice Cooper's personality than Ozzy's, but it does work here in the album's setting. Really don't understand why this song couldn't have been released on both versions of the album. Then we have the dark epic album closer, Waiting for Darkness, which is prime Ozzy. Now, not as grandiose as Diary of a Madman is, but it still packs enough punch to make it stand on its own. Then of course there is the aptly titled Now You See It, parentheses Now You Don't, which is another heavy track with a very cool riff. According to Bob Daisley, this was written as a pointed rebuke aimed at Sharon Osbourne, who had previously fired him from the band. However, Daisley has stated that he was shocked that Sharon allowed Ozzy to keep the lyrics for the song, knowingly who the song was targeted at. So what? There are some lighter touches to this album. It still contains the same personality of the first two albums. I think the better word to use here is transitional, which does mean that it's pushing towards that sound that he would later adopt after this album. But the writing and style of the first is still very present here when you really begin to break things down. Jakey Lee is technically a bit different from that of Randy Rhoads, but you can tell that Jakey still had heart. Now, this does bring me to the writing of the album. Now, there are plenty of different accounts of how or who wrote the majority of the album. Now, Sharon claims that Ozzy wrote and composed the majority of the songs, but Jakey has disputed this claim, even stating that Sharon cheated him out of the writing and publishing. Bob Daisley has been on record backing up Lee, further stating that he co-wrote most of the music with Lee and wrote the vast majority of the lyrics, as appointed with Now You See It, parentheses Now You Don't. Daisley had also stated that he accepted a buyout from Osbourne in exchange for a writing credit. Now, both Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake were both previously fired on the start of the tour for Diary of a Madman. But as stated by Daisley, he had been rehired by Sharon Osbourne to write the Bark at the Moon album for an estimated $50,000 to $60,000. He was offered the chance to write with Ozzy, lyrics and music. And as far as the production goes, while technically both Ozzy and Bob helped produce, Max Norman was still paid to produce, but this would be his final effort working with Ozzy. I must now bring attention to the difference between the original mix and this, of course, here being the 2002 remix. Back in 2002, when Ozzy was reissuing his original catalog with new remastering, except for The Ultimate Sin, which had been excluded from this series of reissues, Sharon had the bright idea of re-recording Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake's parts for the first two albums, yet for some reason, not for Bark at the Moon. Instead, Bob's parts were kept here, making it a rather simple remix, or so. The difference with the 2002 remix is that some of Jake E's guitar parts were deleted and Don Airey's keyboards and effects were mixed lower, no longer being put at the forefront of the mix as they were originally. These edits are mostly felt on the title track and Rock and Roll Rebel. You're No Different this time ends without a fade out, and Century of Eternity has an alternate intro, which might be one of my few complaints about the remix, cause I do prefer the original intro over the updated alternate intro. But besides the unnecessary changes to the title track and even Rock and Roll Rebel, now this is gonna be a bit of a shocker to most of you, but between the original mix and here, the 2002 remix, I kind of prefer the 2002 remix. I think my reasons for preferring this mix over the original is that I pretty much feel that Tommy Aldridge's drum snares and just overall sound is more pushed up to the front here than compared to of the original mix. Now, I mean, just take a listen to, of course, the version of You're No Different off of this mix, cause on the original, Tommy Aldridge just sounded like he was really pushed back, and therefore he just had this almost hollowed sound, and it just, I think it did not really do the track justice. So, it's just, I think that there's more consistency, I think, between, for me, on the 2002 remix than compared to the original mix. However, though, if it had contained a lot of the deleted parts that were found on the original mix, then I think to me this right here would be my preferred mix of the album. But even with that, I just tend to really find more to like about the remix. After this album, Tommy Aldridge would leave the band to then be replaced by, for a short time period, Carmine Appice, brother of Vinny, who was drumming for Ozzy's rival, Ronnie James Dio. But besides being featured in the video for the title track, Carmine would be fired, to which Tommy Aldridge would be brought back. When Ozzy was asked in an early February issue of Hit Parader on why Carmine was let go and why Tommy was brought back, he had this to say: "For health reasons, he was making me sick." What was he doing that was more disgusting than smearing shit all over the hotel walls? Like what? Shoving a cactus up his rear end? However, by the wake of the album's release, a Canadian man named James Jolimore murdered a woman and her 2 children after allegedly listening to the album. The media and Christian groups began to infer that the music was satanic and had influenced Jolimore to commit the act. The timing was particularly inopportune for Osbourne, who was, at the time, facing allegations that his song Suicide Solution had influenced a fan to commit suicide, when in fact the song Suicide Solution was about alcohol abuse, and of course even the death of Bon Scott. Now, Diary of a Madman will always be my favorite Ozzy solo album. However, over time, I've always thought what was my second favorite or third. I would go back and forth on this one over years. I mean, some days I felt it was Blizzard, and then there were some days where I felt that it was maybe, of course, the album that pretty much exposed me to Ozzy in the first place, that being No More Tears. But I think in recent, or at least couple years, and especially when preparing for this episode, I think I pretty much just found what is in my top 5 Ozzy solo albums. So there you have it. Bark at the Moon is now 40 years old. If you have any memories of this album, you know what to do. But if you are, of course, have, let's say, any sort of thoughts, if they are either positive or negative, you can leave them all in the comments section below. But let's say you avoided this album for years, or let's say you just never quite clicked with this album. And then I say give it another chance. But if you're just unfamiliar with Ozzy's solo work in general and are just curious on where to start, then I'd say start with Diary of a Madman first. But still, this is not a bad album to go with. So there you go. This is Heavy Thrash saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. And take care, everyone.